I definitely still worry about my brother's health, and the transplants obviously doesn't magically fix everything, but it does give him a new lease on life.
Welcome to the CHC Podcast. I am Anna Jaworski and a heart mom to an adult with a single ventricle heart. I have a co-host here with me today.
I'm Ayrton Beatty, and I am a bereaved sibling of a brother who died from an undiagnosed heart defect, and I have drug-induced long QT syndrome due to treatment for my chronic health conditions.
Today's episode features a very special panel of guests who were on our show just the month before, and they're all siblings of someone who was born with a heart defect, but today they are specifically here to talk to us about what it's like to be the sibling of someone who has received a heart transplant. So with us today are Roy Simkhay, Michelle Steltzer, Stephen Guerin, and Amy Cowin. Welcome back, Roy. We're so happy you could come back for this episode.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm really excited to continue the conversation.
Michelle, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Thank you so much for having me back. I really appreciate you.
Amy, thank you so much for coming back on the program today.
Thank you so much for having me back. Been a pleasure.
Stephen, thank you so much for coming back on the program today.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
Roy Simkhay is Guy Simkhay's younger brother. Roy is 5 years younger than his brother and was an adult when his brother received a heart transplant. Roy is a computer programmer for a real estate company. Roy has visited Guy in the hospital on multiple times to support Guy. Michelle Steltzer is a bereaved sister. Her brother, Greg Romanesco, was born with a single ventricle heart. Born in 1968, he had a classic Fontan in 1985, but ended up having a heart transplant at Mayo Clinic in 2015. Sadly, he passed away from complications related to his heart transplant.
Amy Cowin is sister to Jessica Cowin, who was born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, or HLHS. Jessica also had a classic Fontan and also needed a heart transplant. Amy's story is unique because she gave her sister Jessica a kidney when Jessica was in kidney failure. Stephen Guerin is brother to Cora, who was on the CHC podcast for our National Transplant Awareness Month episode just this past April. Like most of the guests on this panel, Stephen's sibling was born with a single ventricle heart, HLHS, and required a heart transplant.
This question is for everyone. How did your life change once your sibling discovered they needed a transplant? Stephen, would you like to answer first?
Yes. I actually remember the exact circumstances when I found out that my sister would need a transplant. My aunt was visiting our house, and we were all sitting in the living room. It was around Christmas time. I don't know why she was the one to break the news. She said, "Corey, you're going to need to get a new heart one day." That's not news that she wanted to hear. She started crying, and I remember thinking, oh, that's going to be something in a couple years. I was really young at the time. I think I was in like first or second grade. After that, there was this joke among my house. We called it the call. And the call was basically like when we found out that Cora would get her new heart, like when she'd actually get it. I'm going to tell when the call happened. Me and my dad have always been fans of rugby. We were in Chicago watching a game. Since my dad is an immigrant from Ireland, we've always supported the Ireland team. And they were playing in Chicago against New Zealand, which were the best team in the world at that time. Not anymore. And like in the middle of the first half, we get the call. My dad just grabs my arm and says, "We have to go." Like all times we could have gotten it. Had to be now, which sounds a little bit selfish, but it was pretty funny. We didn't even stop at the hotel. I don't know how he managed to get us a flight to Philadelphia, which is where her transplant was. I remember my dad watching like a play-by-play on his phone in the airport terminal. And Ireland actually won that game, which was the first time in 112 years that Ireland has beaten the best team in the world of New Zealand. It's just a funny story. I guess that's a good analogy for how a transplant can affect your life.
My dad also comes from a family of Irish immigrants, so I grew up supporting the Irish rugby team, so I can wholeheartedly sympathize with you on that one.
Thank you.
Rory, what about you? How did your life change once your sibling discovered they needed a transplant?
Yeah, Guy's heart transplant was a relatively recent development. We were in our 40s. He's had so many surgeries over the years, so much scar tissue that had built up that he started having complications from it. The electrical signals in his heart just not functioning the way they were supposed to, having a lot of VT storms. When the doctors first started telling us that he might need a transplant, it seemed very scary to me. It felt like a dire situation that I really hoped we wouldn't get to. It just seemed like such a scary concept, such a hard spot to be in. I spoke with somebody who happens to be a doctor, and they really changed my perspective and explained what a huge opportunity the transplant would be for him, knowing his medical condition and the complications he had had, and how if that's what it came to, if he was going to need a heart transplant, that would be a fantastic thing for him, a new lease on life. This doctor had seen many patients who had heart transplants and were doing great afterwards. When it finally came that the doctor said it really was time to pursue that heart transplant list, I was still scared, but at least I had that perspective and thought of it as something that would be really good for him and help him out. He had his transplant a little bit over a year ago. Unfortunately, it came during the COVID pandemic that added an extra level of complexity. He was already in a fragile medical state with the congenital heart condition. Then, of course, the immunosuppressants with the transplant made things more complicated. Had to be careful, especially with young kids in the family exposing him. And so that definitely made it harder because it limited how much we could see each other. I remember exactly where I was the moment that they called us and said he had a heart donor. It came much faster on the list than we were expecting, but I was in the middle of playing a pickleball game and got a call from a relative where I was like, they don't usually call me in the middle of the day. So I answered and just kind of started crying in the court when I heard the news. It was really emotional to have him go through that. It was hard to see him in the hospital there. It was such a big surgery, so complicated what they do there. And I have so much humility and appreciation for the entire medical staff, but really hard to see him and what he had to go through for that. It's so fantastic to see him now. Guy was born with a bad heart. And because of this transplant, it's the first time that he has a good heart. He's done such an amazing job dealing with all the medicines and the immunosuppressants. It's a complicated situation to be in post-transplant, and he just deals with it so well.
Yeah, sometimes you just need to have someone to give you that change in perspective on making things seem less scary from the outside. Michelle, how did your life change once your sibling discovered they needed their transplant?
It's complicated like most people. My brother and his wife were very intentional about the timing of the transplant evaluation process and when to move forward in the fall of 2014. Incidentally, he got the call about a donor match on Sibling's Day in 2015 after nearly 200 days inpatient. So that was a moment that I will never forget. As he was traveling this journey, I knew transplant was next on the table because he had already been home on milrinone, didn't have improvement, and that would be the next step to offer a quality of life. At the time, Greg's son, my godson, had just gotten his driver's license, so that helped logistically. And certainly Greg and I had many conversations about scheduled visits and ongoing support when he was admitted for his much needed transplant process and gift of life. Since I had just relocated from Boston Children's, working as a nurse practitioner, to the Midwest, I had not yet secured a pediatric nurse practitioner position, which is probably a blessing in disguise because Milwaukee is not a stone's throw away from Rochester. It takes several hours to get there, and it takes a long time to get that magical gift of life. But allowed us to have scheduled visits, and we're very intentional about phone calls, monthly visits. I would travel up, taking time away from my own family. We'd email, find times to laugh and be silly, and help him with ongoing support. Certainly he had maternal and paternal support, but my parents did not like to drive outside their local community. And at the time, my kids couldn't be left alone. My daughter was upgraded her senior year and recovering from ACL surgery, and my son was entering middle school. So having to orchestrate a busy life made an impact. I'm grateful for the time that I did have to participate during that journey.
I think it's harder in some ways when you're an adult sibling and you do have all of those other obligations. I know that Joey was in college when Hope had her last open heart surgery, and he took some time away to drive the 2 hours to San Antonio from where he was in school in Georgetown, Texas. And he couldn't be there for Hope like he was able to when Hope was younger. So I think it's harder as you all get older, don't you think, Michelle? Wasn't that a more challenging
I
experience for you than when
I
he was
do.
younger?
Yeah, when we were younger, I was part of the immediate family unit, and as you get older, you're part of a different type of family support system, and
Yeah.
communication is so important. And you have busy lives, making sure that my youngest son had somebody to bring him to his orchestra practice. One time when I went up to visit my brother, I had his middle school music teacher actually take him to Milwaukee because I couldn't be there because of unforeseen circumstances. There's so many different stressors and barriers that surround the family system and the unit. And I agree 100%, Anna, that as you become older, it's a little bit more difficult to be present. It was very important for me to be present in a way that was supportive to Greg, which is part of the important conversations that we had pre and throughout his wait time.
Well, and I think what makes this situation so challenging too is that you weren't just there for Greg. I'm sure you were there for his wife and children too, as much as you could be.
Exactly. Yeah. His birthday is April 24th, and this would be 9 years that he's been not present in the family. And every year I'm grateful for the gift of life, but it hurts when he's not there. I still text his wife, call and participate in their family, but it's hard that he was taken before some of these milestones that I have shared that he's missing.
Right. Did you feel that you also needed to be there for your parents, Michelle?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I remember the day that he went to the operating room, and my mom had a hard time saying goodbye at the day of the transplant. And he looked at me and gave me the nod, take care of mom. It's hard. My parents were dealing with significant loss of one of their children with medical complexity, and no one wants to see their child die before them. And the reality was, it might actually come to be. It's an incredible stressor, but I wouldn't change it in any circumstance. I love my parents. I love my brothers. I love my brother's family. You do what you need to do in order to help everybody be resilient and thrive. Greg had incredible circumstances. He endured incredible barriers throughout his lifetime, and he did it with hope. And he always said, God has a plan. And I truly believe that.
I do too. That's such a beautiful story.
Amy, how did your life change once your sibling discovered they needed their transplant?
We were at the cardiologist's office, just my mom, my sister, and I. I was sitting out in the front, and the cardiologist told my sister that she's going to need a transplant. And so she was obviously distraught. And then the worst part was that her cardiologist was going to need to change to a whole different team. With her, it was a lot of reassuring her that things are going to be okay. She really didn't have to wait very long. She was on the list for maybe 3 weeks, and we had just gotten the pager. She was just so upset about it that she threw the package on the dining room table and didn't even open it, didn't set up the pager. And a couple days later, we got the call. We were supposed to go to New York for Starlight Wish Foundation, something like Make a Wish. And she was like, I don't want to go to the hospital. She's like, I want to go to New York. And we're like, we're going to have to postpone that. And we had maybe 4 hours or 6 hours to get to the hospital. We're in Chicago, so we were going to Lurie Children's, and it was in Lincoln Park at the time. So it was just a lot of promising, promising to do things after the transplant. I promised to go horseback riding with her because I knew she liked that, and to reassure her that we're going to do stuff together when this is over and she's going to feel better. And that was the main goal, was to feel better. It was exhausting. I don't think we slept that night. I think it was like a 12-hour surgery. And we were in this long hallway and we were all crying and we're all hugging her and telling her it's going to be okay. And she's telling us it's going to be okay. It was just a surreal moment. And I don't know how that's going to look when this happens again. It was kind of crazy that this was all happening. So very surreal and life-changing.
Such an amazing story.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Amy.
Thank you.
Amy, you gave your sister a kidney when she went into kidney failure. You have been such a supportive sibling. We know that when a person receives a heart transplant, they may need to have another transplant later in life. Now that you and your sister are grown up, how do you think it'll affect you when or if Jessica needs another heart?
Yeah, so we just celebrated 15 years post-kidney, and Jessica is on her 25th year post-heart transplant. About a year and a half ago, she was worked up for another heart transplant. She had, I think, 5 or 6 stents put in within 6 months, and they were really worried. They worked her up for another transplant, and she did all of her tests, and she ended up having good results in her next heart cath. So they've put that on the back burner for now.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we're just continuing every day to see how she's doing, and she is doing really well. She's active, she's working full time, she feels good, and I think the kidney was shocking when that happened. Obviously, the heart was shocking when that happened. She was almost 16 and I was 13. It's going to be another process. I think in certain ways she doesn't want to do another one, but she knows she has to. And of course she will. But yeah, it's going to be a lot. It hasn't been easy getting to this point, but I know when and if she needs another one, we're just going to do it. We're just going to deal with it. But it is going to be scary, of course. And it's going to be an adjustment. Things are not going to be easy. So,
Right.
yeah, and now that she's going to be 41 this year,
That just doesn't seem possible.
I know. We're getting so old.
But you're
And
also in another unique position, aren't you? Because your mom was listed for a transplant not
she
too long
was.
ago.
Yeah.
So you've really seen this whole transplant and CHD situation from a very
Yeah.
unique vantage point.
Yeah. And my mom is doing really well. She has a pacemaker and her doctors are happy. It's funny because my sister's old cardiologist is my mom's cardiologist now, which is crazy when things run in the family and it's not genetic at all. We've done all the genetic testing. So it's just a random thing that's
Yeah.
happened.
But I think what's so amazing about your family, Amy, is how the three of you have always been by each other's sides, no matter what you're
Oh, yeah.
going through.
Yeah.
I mean, your mom went
Definitely.
through cancer, and you two girls were there for her with that too.
Mm-hmm.
I know you girls will be there. You will
Yeah.
be there. Eileen will be there if and when your sister needs something. I'm hoping that they do some amazing work with stem cells and being able to use native tissue if she has to get another heart, but it's her own native tissue. That would
Right.
just be so amazing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be. That would be incredible. For the kidney transplant, we were a perfect match, except for she had had a previous heart transplant. So it changed her antibodies. So she needed to go through plasmapheresis a couple times. But other than that, we would have been a perfect match and she possibly wouldn't have needed medication. But since she's a previous transplant, she's on the same medication she was for the heart as she is for the kidney.
Yeah, you guys have such an amazing story.
Thank you.
Embark on a heartwarming odyssey with Baby Heart's Pressure Gateway to uplifting stories for the CHD community. Introducing The Heart of a Heart Warrior book series, inspiring those born with heart defects and their loved ones. Discover the heart of a mother, the heart of a father, and my brother needs an operation. Books celebrating strength, love, and familial support. Visit babyheartspress.com and be part of our loving community, uplifting hearts one story at a time.
You are listening to the CHC Podcast. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our show, please send an email to Anna Jaworski at anna@thechcpodcast.com. That's anna@thechcpodcast.com. Now, back to the CHC Podcast.
Welcome back. We're talking about siblings to heart warriors who have received heart transplants in today's episode. And now our audience is able to share their experiences or ask questions of our panelists. And Frank, we're so happy to have you in the audience today. I'd love to know if you have any questions or experiences you'd like to share with us.
Actually, yes, I would. We did not have to deal with transplant as an issue in our house, but we were aware that Hope was vulnerable to infection after surgeries. So we were careful with our kids. Her older brother, Joey, was homeschooled like she was. So there wasn't a question of him being exposed to germs outside of the house as much as he would if he'd gone to school. And I'm curious, during the immune suppressed part of their care, which I guess is all the time after their transplants, were you ever aware of the fact that bringing home germs could be an issue, or did it ever affect your life when you were sick in the home also? Were you segregated from the family, or how was that handled?
Wow, that's such a good question. Amy, let's start with you because I know that you were around Jessica a lot and you guys were in high school, or she was in high school. I'm not sure if you were in high school or middle school when that happened.
The heart transplant?
Yes.
She was 16, so she was in high school. I was 13. And she spent a lot of time out of school, actually. She had tutors that would come to the house. For the immediate post-transplant, she was in ICU for, I think, about a month. She stayed at the hospital and she had one of those double door rooms. You had to suit up and mask and booties and all that stuff. We definitely worried about it. We had dogs, so she wasn't allowed to go clean up after them. My mom was really careful and she would make us wear masks sometimes when we went places.
She made you wear one too?
Yeah. Yeah. She would make us wear masks if we were cleaning in the house or cleaning dusty things or whatever it was. She was like, just wear gloves, wear masks. She also has a ton of allergies, so she was prepared. That kind of lessened the further away we got from the initial transplant. And we definitely worried more about it during COVID. With any virus or disease or whatever is going on with the general public, it's always just been, we have to be more careful. So we did. We were really careful during COVID. We didn't go out. When we got groceries, we would clean them off and we just minimized the exposure as much as possible. And thankfully, I still have not gotten it. She did get it just not very long ago. So she's been fine. But yeah, we just have to be extra careful.
Did you feel that it changed the way you participated in after school activities?
I really wasn't interested in extracurricular things. I was more shy when I was little, and Jessica was more the outgoing one. And she loved going to sleepovers and going out with her friends. And just to be that restrictive, she didn't love that. But she did have friends come over to the house and like see her and hang out and stuff like that. And as soon as she was more able to, she did stuff. I've always worried. I think sometimes she's a big worrier, and then I worried a lot more just silently.
What about you, Roy? It was very different for you because your brother was an adult. You were probably not living in the same household. But how did your siblings' immune compromised status affect you? And it probably did have a big effect because it was during COVID.
Yeah, that's right. Guy's transplant was just about a year and a half ago. So we're both adults. We don't live together right now. I don't think the immune suppressed status affected me as much as it would have if we were kids together, but it does make me cautious, obviously, when visiting. I've got young kids, so there seems to always be something going around. So try to be really careful when coming to visit, but we make do. That might mean Guy being with the mask on, or we keep a window or a door open, just extra cautious about some of those things, and still get to see each other and still get to do all those things, but just a little bit more cautious.
What about you, Michelle? Did you get a chance to visit with your brother after he'd had the transplant?
I did. And I think, honestly, I didn't notice much difference because we were older and it was the healthcare environment. So I don't think it really impacted me because he was still in the hospital. I do think it would have, if he survived out of the hospital, it definitely would have impacted our family's behavior and how we participated if he made it out of the hospital, but he never made it out. So,
Right. So you had the same precautions that anybody would have visiting a transplant patient in the hospital.
yeah,
So you had to suit up. And when they're in the hospital, they put a lot of restrictions on visitors, don't they?
yeah. His transplant was pre-COVID and there wasn't as many concerns. Obviously, there were still infectious concerns. The hospital is not certainly a germ-free risk. But thinking back at it, I don't really recall a significant difference, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And now Stephen is the one that probably was most impacted by this question because your sister was so much younger when she got her heart defect, and you're a little brother. So, can you tell us how your siblings' immune compromised status affected you growing up, Stephen?
It's interesting because a lot of people were talking about COVID, but COVID wasn't even a factor when she got her transplant in 2016, which was a bit before COVID. So there was no concern about that. COVID freaked the whole family out, particularly Cora, because she was immunocompromised, which, duh, with the whole immunocompromised thing. But yeah, I was never really a dirty child. A big thing for my mother, because she was kind of the one who was most there with the transplant stuff. She was very, very heavy emphasis on the Purell, the hand sanitizer, especially during COVID. She'd have us, if we even went out to get the mayo, Purelling our hands, which in hindsight, it was a bit much, but I guess it made a lot of sense at the time. Also, I know dogs are a big source of germs, and my sister loves dogs. So naturally, that causes a bit of a conflict of interest when you have an immunocompromised child and a dog that loves to make messes.
Now, were you able to have a dog? Because way back when, almost 30 years ago, when the doctors talked to us about transplant being a possibility, they made it sound like we wouldn't be allowed to have a pet or that it was not a wise idea to have a pet.
We were allowed to have a pet. There was never really an issue with the pet and the transplant. So I guess that's good. No, it never really caused a problem.
So, were you able to have birthday parties at your house and have friends sleep over and those
Absolutely.
typical things?
She wasn't worried about germs stealing from children. Now, there's one thing that she absolutely despised when we were at the hospital, and that was the hospital floors. She tells me this story when I was a baby. I was playing in the hospital and I started crawling around on the hospital floor. My mother telling me how she freaked out because hospital floors to her are basically like transplant Satan. So
I love you, Valerie. I can imagine I would be the same way. That is so funny.
yeah,
Okay. Well,
Stephen, I have to tell you myself, I'm a nurse. I work in hospitals every day. And
she's
you
right.
know,
I know, right?
she is right. It doesn't matter what part of the hospital you're in because whatever you get on your feet, you track all over the place. People at home will drop a piece of food and say, oh, 5-second rule and pick it up. There is no 5-second rule in the hospital.
There's no 5-second rule in my house either.
Good for you. When it hits the floor, it's gone. That's smart.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
Annie, I think you have one more question for the panelists.
I just want to be respectful here. Did you ever think your sibling could now be fixed after their transplant? Or did you worry more that they may have more heart issues afterwards instead? Amy, go ahead.
Yes. So it seemed like a transplant was going to be the fix all, and it's definitely not. I kind of thought, okay, she's going to be better now, and we won't have to go to all these doctor's appointments, and she'll just be able to live a normal life. It's very much not like that. They don't have a cure for any of these things, and a transplant is just another step in her health journey. So you go from being elated that this is happening, and then you're like, oh, it's not the one and done kind of a thing. It's very much like a life and death situation. There's no end. It's kind of like a Band-Aid for a little bit. She has a friend. We know somebody who's 35 years post-transplant and still doing well. And I think it's something she thinks about. We have another friend who's had 2 heart transplants, and she's still relatively young. So it's definitely not a one and done. It's just a continuation and just like a different way of going about new issues, because definitely other things have come up since that.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. It's true. People unfortunately do feel sometimes that the transplant is the one and done, and it's good to know that the word out there is that there can be far more complications down the line or other issues. It's a Band-Aid. Thank you, Amy. Rory, what would you like to say?
I definitely still worry about my brother's health, and the transplants obviously doesn't magically fix everything, but it does give him a new lease on life, years more that we get to spend together and lots more memories we get to make together. And so that's really what I focus on. I realize he's got a lot of different new challenges now with this new heart, but just so grateful that he has it, so grateful that he has all this extra time with us, and his heart's better than it's ever been, even as he deals with all the complications that come up having a transplant.
Thank you, Rory, so much. I really appreciate your answer. Stephen, your thoughts?
Well, with Cora, we found out that she had to be treated with the surgery for scoliosis, basically right after the transplant. So in my mind, it was kind of connected to the transplant. There was some worry of rejection, and there was a rejection issue this year, actually, which was surprising to me because I always thought of it as it's done. I mean, it's not really done. There's still appointments that she has to go to every so often. There was no heart issues until this year where they found some rejection, and we had to drop everything and take her out of university. And it was scary. I'm going to be honest. I hadn't felt like that in a while. I realized it's really something we're going to have to deal with for life because it hadn't really come up since I was 9. Yeah.
Yeah. What's difficult too is when you've experienced things, all of you younger, and now you're experiencing them, whether it's teenage years or adult years, it can become more difficult because you don't always remember everything when you were younger. You don't remember the stress or the worries. And if you had worries, they weren't the worries that you would now have understanding and comprehending more. And also really looking at your sibling and seeing their faces and their mannerisms and how they're reacting to it, even if they're not vocalizing it. So thank you. And Michelle, did you want to answer?
I agree with Amy and talking about not one and done and really trading one disease for another. But what I was really hopeful was that I'd have another decade with him, including more milestones. I think what I really worried about, knowing that his new heart was strong, I really worried more about the consequences of the comorbidities that kept adding up that ultimately led to his death, I found myself focusing more and more on those than having more heart issues. Realizing you're trading one disease for another with congenital heart disease, and now you're going towards transplant, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense because you're right. There are other factors. And as you're thinking about those and then you're seeing firsthand those factors come up, you do say to yourself, my goodness, I thought the transplant would be kind of it. And yes, I knew that other things could arise, but you hope that they don't and you get that opportunity, the length in the relationship that you want and you hope for and strive for with your sibling. So it does make a lot of sense. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
What surprised you the most? Annie, do you want to go first?
This is a really hard question for me because having that younger sibling, and they were all younger siblings, in a sense, there really wasn't any surprises. My surprise was how their normal, even though it seemed unique for each one of them, it was not unique for each one of them when they were together in a panel. Like if they were finally almost like little kindred spirits thinking, we have this opportunity listening to each other. And wow, we actually had all similar experiences. We had all similar things. So I think that for me was like, when you meet another CHDer, you all of a sudden go, oh my God, someone who understands. Even if you don't have the same CHD, they understand. And they got that opportunity to understand with each other.
Yeah. Guy, what about you? What surprised you the most?
This episode hit me in very good ways. Michelle's story touched me because she is the only bereaved sibling in the panel.
Yeah, it really touched me too. And I'm so glad that she felt that she could be part of the panel and she expressed herself so eloquently. So I'm glad you said that, Guy. I think it was a little surprising to me how she could really hold it together. I was in tears, and I know Annie was too, while she was sharing some of her story, and yet she was so controlled. I have a hard time controlling the tears when I start talking about some of these things, as all of you are witness to.
I know, I completely agree. I feel like we should all have electronic tissues or something. So we don't.
that, that electronic tissues.
But it is
Well,
true. It's
yeah,
such poise. And you as well,
yeah,
Ayrton, both of you, when you're asking questions and speaking towards each other about
yeah.
things that you both felt and could only feel. So thank you for that.
Yeah, not always easy to talk about losing Edward, but sometimes when you have another bereaved sibling you can share experiences with, it does make it easier.
Yeah.
But like I said to Michelle, there's not a lot of support out there for us. There's loads of
No.
support for bereaved parents and bereaved children, but there's absolutely none for those of us who have lost a sibling.
Yeah. Yeah. I hate to think how many people will need to hear this episode, Ayrton, if for nothing else than for the conversation that you and Michelle had, because that was really amazing. I'd love to know what everybody's biggest takeaway was. We'll start with you, Annie.
I think my biggest takeaway here, Anna and Ayrton and Guy, through all of this was that, like Ayrton just said, we don't have this opportunity for siblings of congenital heart patients, whether they are bereaved or not, to be able to speak or somehow have an opportunity, if they aren't able to speak words, write out, paint out, do something, some kind of therapy so that they can help process what they're going through, whether they're children, teenagers, or adults. The processing is never ending, just like the congenital heart defected patients' issues are never ending. And whether we're still here or passed away, the sibling still has to continue processing and dealing. I'm really hoping that this, in the end, inspires people in the medical community and in social work, as well as therapists, to possibly ask and go further in the questions of, as the sibling of a CHDer, how are you doing? They're able to ask that question. How are you doing?
I absolutely love that. That's absolutely true. We need to get this episode to all child life specialists, to the cardiothoracic surgeons, the cardiologists, to the parents. Really, everybody needs to know about this episode and the impact having a child with a heart defect has on the siblings. That was beautifully said, Annie. What about you, Guy? What was your biggest takeaway?
My biggest takeaway was the fact that the panelists all got to know each other.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I love that. What about you, Ayrton?
Yeah, again, for me, it was the fact that every single one of the panelists said that they felt alone, that it was just them who was going through it. When in fact, CHD is the most common birth defect. There are millions more siblings out there, and they need to know they are not alone.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, my biggest takeaway is that the siblings are affected by having a heart warrior sibling and that their experiences do change as the siblings get older, but the bond that they have is there forever and they want to be there for their siblings no matter what. That really inspired me that even when the siblings were adults and had their own families, they were willing to move heaven and earth to be there for their siblings. And that really impressed me.
I totally agree with what you just said. I think, obviously, my experience was different from what everyone was saying, that the bond did seem to grow stronger through adulthood.
So many times, my bereaved friends tell me that one of the hardest parts about being bereaved is that nobody wants to say their name. Nobody wants you to share about them. And we were willing to hear about it. Annie, what did you think about the show?
I loved it. I feel like there are so many siblings of congenital heart patients who are going to be able to relate to this in so many ways. Even if not every emotion or topic was talked about, they still will understand.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What about you, Ayrton?
I think that it was an important episode to have done because siblings are often just as important as caregivers because they often get overlooked.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And yeah, one thing that I think is true is that a lot of times the siblings are also caregiving. They may not be responsible for paying the bills or they may not be responsible for making the decisions, but they're still giving care to their siblings. So that's a beautiful insight, Ayrton.
Thank you for joining us today for the CHC Podcast. We hope you join us next month for our September episode, where we'll be talking about congenital heart defect diagnosis discovered in adulthood. Until then, I'm Ayrton Beatty.
And I'm Anna Jaworski. Have a great day and keep those congenital heart conversations going on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard today, please consider becoming a patron. Then you can join our conversation too. To become a patron, all you have to do is visit heartsunitetheglobe.com and click on the donate button.
Thank you for joining us. The CHC Podcast can be heard monthly wherever you get your podcasts. Visit us on Facebook or Instagram to continue the conversations. Join the Hearts Unite the Globe Patreon group and become part of our town hall meetings. It's simple. Just visit www.heartsunitetheglobe.org and select the tab that says Donate to Hug with Patreon. Then you too can be part of the conversation.